Right. Okay, so here's where we are now in our study in Module 3 on poetry and wisdom literature. And so our focus is going to be on the Old Testament. We were just talking about that. It's going to be on the Old Testament because most of the poetry, the poetic genre we find is in the Old Testament. Obviously the poetic books, the book of Psalms, it's poetry, the wisdom books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. I'm missing one. What's the other book, wisdom book? It's escaped me. There's 4. Job, are all written in poetic, using poetic language. Most of the prophetic books are written using poetic language. In fact, I believe all of the poetic books have it. All of the prophetic books have at least some poetry, but many of the prophetic books have a majority of the book is poetry. Like Habakkuk, it's all poetic language. Amos, Joel, all poetic. Or sorry, not Amos. Nahum, Joel, all poetic. So the poetic genre is significant in the Old Testament, but as I've said a couple of times, we do see some Hebrew poetry or poetic elements in the New Testament. I think we discussed that last session with the Ephesians chapter 1. We see Paul using some poetic elements. He uses refrain in Ephesians 1. We see some structure that's similar to a psalm in Ephesians 1. And some of the language he uses, blessed be the Lord our God. And so there are places in the New Testament we do see poetic devices used. Colossians 1, I think 15 or 16, uses a chiasm. Romans 8 uses merism. And when it's talking about neither height nor depth, angels nor principalities, nothing can separate us from the love of God. So he uses merism there. So Luke chapter 1, Mary's Magnificat actually is a psalm. And we see Hebrew parallelism actually in that. So there are places even in the New Testament that we see Hebrew poetry. So understanding the stuff that we are talking about here will not only help you in interpreting Old Testament poetic passages, but also too when we see some of that in the New Testament. So today, the goal is, my desire is to introduce us then now to the process, the exegetical process for studying poetry. We've spent time so far in this module on understanding the features of Hebrew poetry. We've talked about terseness and imagery, structure, parallelism, stanzas, figurative language, other poetic devices. I've been giving you some of the features of Hebrew poetry. Now I want to go back to, okay, well, so how do we study a poetic text? So that's our goal, is to introduce that today. And notice here is the exegetical process. Here's the process to find the authorial intent of a particular poetic text in the Old Testament. And here, as you're studying a book that is a poetic book, these are the steps you're going to take to uncover the meaning of a particular passage in that book. Notice this should look very similar to what we've already seen for narratives and for epistles, right? Almost every step will be the same. The only step that is different will be this 4th step, okay, where we will do a specific analysis of the poetic devices and the poetic elements of the passage. But notice the first 3 steps are all looking at the book as a whole, making observations, getting the background context and the literary context of the book. All right, that's the same that we would do for narratives. It's the same we would do for epistles. All right. However, the only difference, and I'll explain this in more detail in a moment, notice we will not do these first three steps for the Psalms. All right, the Psalms is a unique book in the Bible. I'll give you more information on that in a minute. But all of the steps, except for Psalms, every book of the Bible, if you're studying a passage from that book, you need to do the first three steps. Now, the fourth step is where we look specifically at the poetic elements of the passage. And if you remember, when we did narratives in Module 2, this was where we did narrative analysis. Okay, was that fourth step, where we looked at specific elements of the narrative to try to better understand it. So, and then the steps after that, the block diagram, textual observations, significant words, consult resources, and then the author's what, why, how. Those are all the same. We do those same steps when we study epistles. We do those same steps when we study narrative, except block diagramming is not as significant for narratives. But we will see it again here for poetry. All right. So the only real new step that we're going to need to focus on in this module is that step number 4. The rest of the steps you should already be familiar with. All right. So let's just quickly look at the first 3 steps here. All right. If you're studying a poetic book, you want to read the entire book through several times, just as we were to do for narratives and epistles, and make observations of the book. All right. So it's going to be the same kind of thing. So if you're studying, say, Nahum, which is a prophetic book, but as I said, it also is a poetic book. You're going to read the book several times, get familiar with the book, make observations. It's going to be that way for any book that you look at. It's the poetic genre, just like each other genre. And then the second step will be to understand the background context of the book. That is the setting of the book. All right. And that includes details about who the author, the recipients, so why did he write the book? What prompted him to write the book? What's his purpose? Okay. And this is the same information that we have looked at before when studying background context. We looked at it when we did narratives, and we looked at it when we did epistles. All right. So that's going to be the same kind of thing. So if you're studying the book of Proverbs, for example, we will do the background context of the book. All right. There's an author, there's a recipients, there's a historical background, there's places, there's geographical context, there's social context, there's names mentioned, all of those same elements that we have studied for in the previous 2 modules we're going to do. And then finally, for example, Jonah, right? We've studied that book of Jonah. At least some of us did for the module 2 on narratives, right? And we have the author. Who's the likely author for Jonah? Anybody?
Jonah himself.
Jonah himself.
Yeah, it's likely Jonah, since the prophets were the authors of the other prophetic books. Okay. Now, who appears to be the audience? Again, remember, Jonah is a prophet of Israel. So who is the audience of the book?
Israel.
Yeah, remember, Jonah was a prophet to the people of Israel. Now, certainly the subject of the book were the Ninevites, right? That's where Jonah went. But he wrote the book for his people that he was a prophet to, and that's the people of Israel, presumably those in Jonah's time, again, assuming he is the author of the book. So if Jonah is the author, when was it written?
During the days of Jeroboam II.
Yeah, during the days of Jeroboam II. How do we know that?
First Kings.
Yeah, from Kings. Actually, it's Second Kings.
Second Kings. So
Yeah, I think it's in 14. Jonah's mentioned
14, 14. Yeah.
yeah, Second Kings 14. And so if we go back to Second Kings 14, we know the history of when Jonah preached, right? Because we have the information there in Second Kings. Now, when did the story take place? Again, days of Jonah, right? Jonah was the prophet who went to Nineveh. Okay, so the story took place in his lifetime. Okay, and then if he wrote the book, then the book as well. Geography, right? What there are places that are mentioned. Obviously, Nineveh is a key place that's mentioned in Jonah, but we also have Joppa, Tarshish. Those are mentioned as well. Okay, so if we're studying the book of Jonah, we would want to understand those locations and study them. That's part of the background context. Now, why was the book of Jonah written? What was its purpose? Anybody?
To call Israel for repentance.
Okay, for what? I mean, from what? What was the message or the key theme of the book that is given there in that book?
In the case of Jonah, Pastor Tim, he didn't have the heart to, the way it's depicted in the book. He didn't have the heart to extend the grace of God. That's the manner of speaking. Extend the grace of God to the Gentiles, and in this case, the Assyrians, because they were their enemies.
Yeah, exactly. And right, the book really was a lesson that shows God's compassion for the lost, right? I mean, his mercy, and that's the last verse of the book, right? Jonah 4:11 reveals the compassion of God for the lost. And the way it reveals it by asking that question at the end, really, I think, is to exhort the reader to have the same compassion. Okay, so that seems to be from studying the book. That seems to be the point of it, or the main focus of it. So this is just to show us, okay, here we have a narrative. The narrative has a background context. There's an author, there's an audience, there's a historical background, there's a purpose to the book, there's geographical context, the places mentioned. That's a narrative. We looked at in Module 1, we looked at the epistle of Philemon. All right, same thing here. This epistle has the elements, all these same elements of background context. All right, who wrote Philemon? Who remembers that?
Paul.
Paul wrote it, right? And who was the audience?
Philemon.
Okay, Philemon was the primary audience, but in the letter, if you remember, it also said to the church in your house. So which we later realized was a Colossian church after studying that book. So, and then when it was written, right, we looked at it was during Paul's first Roman imprisonment, right? We studied, he mentions that he's in prison. And so it was written during his first imprisonment. Geography, the place there is Colossae. So we try to understand a little bit about that. And then why it was written, to encourage Philemon to forgive his runaway slave Onesimus. Okay, so again, background context. Every book has one. Every book has these elements that we want to understand to give us an understanding of the book, because ultimately we want to know two things about the book. Every book of the Bible, we need to understand two things before we're ready to study and preach a particular passage from that book. We need to first know what prompted the book to be written. And secondly, what is the purpose of the book? What is the message of the book? Those are two things. What the occasion for the book, what prompted it to be written, and then the purpose of the book. That is, what is the message that the author wants to give from that book. We have to understand those aspects, the background context of the book, okay? Because that'll give us the why, the context to each of the things that he says within the book. So I just wanted to give you two examples from previous books that we have studied together as part of this class, Jonah and Philemon. But we could have picked any book from the Bible, again, except the Psalms, and come up with identified a background context to the book. So that's the second step that we carry out in preparing to study a passage from a poetic book. And then the third step is, just as with epistles or narratives, poetic books contain unit of thought that the author expresses a contextual flow of the literary context of the book. So if you're studying, again, let's say you're studying Habakkuk, there's a flow of thought in the book. Now, it's all poetic language, but the book has a structure to it, that it begins with Habakkuk's lament, and then God's response, and then Habakkuk's questions about that response, and then God's answer to those questions, and then Habakkuk's declaration of God's sovereign hand in the life of his people, and then he ends it with a psalm, really, in the third chapter. So there's a contextual flow within the book that we need to understand and then our passage, the passage you're studying, will fit somewhere in that flow of thought. All right. Again, this is not a new concept. We've talked about this when we looked at epistles, and then we talked about it again when we looked at narrative. And so these are the first three steps. As I mentioned a moment ago, let me go back up here. These are the first three steps in the exegetical process if you're studying a particular book of the Bible. Now, we need to understand, when we're approaching a book that is poetic, primarily, we need to recognize there are three, I call them three types of books which contain the poetic genre. Okay, three types of books that have poetry as a significant part of the book. Okay, the first type of book is books that are primarily narrative, but they have poetic sections in them. All right, one example, again, comes from our good friend Jonah. If you remember, Jonah is basically a narrative, right? It's the story of Jonah when he was called to preach to the people of Nineveh, and how he refused, and how God, all the events that took place. But remember, in the second chapter in Jonah, it's a psalm, as Jonah's in the belly of the whale, and he's alive somehow, and he expresses this psalm, this poem of thanksgiving to the Lord for rescuing him out of the belly of the fish. And so Jonah 2, though it's a narrative, one whole chapter is poetic. It's the same Exodus 15. There's a song, I think, is it the Song of Miriam there? Let me check. I can't quite remember, but I think it's the Song of Miriam here. All right. When God delivered the people out of, it's a Song of Moses. The Song of Moses, when God delivered the people from the Egyptians, right? They died in the Red Sea. You guys remember that? Right? That was a poem. That's a whole chapter. That's a poem. Deuteronomy 32. Moses gave the people another poem to remember. And it was really a poem that said they were going to rebel against God. It's a kind of a strange song that they were told to memorize. But that's within the book of Deuteronomy. 1 Samuel chapter 2, the prayer of Hannah is given there. Remember when she was childless and was asking the Lord to show grace to her. 2 Samuel 22 is a psalm that David presents at the end of his life. And so there's the first kind of book that contains the poetic genre are narratives, which have a poem or a chapter within the narrative, within the flow of the narrative. Okay, that's one kind. So in those books, right, you're going to study the book as a narrative, right? So for example, the book of Jonah, you study that book as a narrative. You look at the plot analysis, the scene analysis, the character analysis, but within that book, there's one section that is poetic, and you have to look at that section a little differently. All right, in the narrative, you want to understand what is the theme of the poem, how does that fit in the narrative? But when you study the poem, you have to study it as Hebrew poetry, not as a narrative. Does that make sense? So for example, you have Jonah 1, right? That's when Jonah and the storm, right? And then Jonah 2 is the of praise for God's deliverance of him and the fish. Jonah 3 is Jonah in Nineveh, and then Jonah 4 is the plant, right? And the message of Jonah of the book. Okay, so Jonah 1, so this whole story, the whole book we study as a narrative. Okay, where Jonah 1, this is like act 1 of the narrative, right? And act 2 is when he's in the fish. Act 2, not Acts 2. Act 3, right, is when he's in Nineveh. And then act 4 is when he stomps out of Nineveh, all angry. Okay? But when we study the psalm, or the poem, really, the psalm of praise for deliverance here in chapter 2, we're going to look at that poem not like we would the narrative. We need to study it like a poem. And it's the same for all of these. And these are just a few examples. There's many poems scattered throughout the Old Testament in the narrative books. Okay, so that's one kind of a book that contains Hebrew poetry. Any questions on this one? Makes sense, I hope. Okay. All right, now there's a second kind of book that has the poetic genre, and that's basically those books that are primarily poetic. I already mentioned that. The wisdom books, the book of Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, those are pretty much almost all poetic, except for a chapter here and there. Well, Song of Solomon is all poetic. Job is poetic after chapter 2, all the way to the end. Ecclesiastes uses poetry in the whole book. Proverbs uses Hebrew poetry in the whole book. The prophetic books, again, they are, almost all of them are primarily poetic. Now, Isaiah and Jeremiah have some narrative chapters, but most of the book is poetic. And then, as I said, Nahum, Habakkuk, Joel, they are mostly poetic through the whole book. Okay, but the second category of books that have the poetic genre are books that are pretty much all poetic genre. And again, the prophetic books would be all except, I think, Jonah. Well, no, Jonah, we already talked. Jonah would fit in the first category. It's not mostly poetic, but it does have some poetry in it. Okay, so that's the second kind. Now, there's a third kind of book that contains the poetic genre, and that is the book of Psalms. Okay, the book of Psalms. Now, we're all familiar with that book. We would probably say when you think of Hebrew poetry, you think of the Psalms first, right? I mean, that's full of Hebrew poetry. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we approach the book of Psalms, we study that book a little differently. It's not like any other book in the Bible, really, because the book of Psalms is not one book written by one author with one overall purpose. It's actually an anthology. It's a collection, really, of poems. All right. It's a collection of poems where each poem has its own author, purpose, context, right? Occasion. Okay, each poem is unique. It's independent from the other poems. So the book of Psalms is just a collection of all of these poems, and each poem has its own author, its own purpose, its own background, its own circumstance, its own theme. Okay, and so we treat the book of Psalms differently. And so, for example, when we talk about, again, the summary of the steps to study and preach biblical poetry, we would do the first 3 steps except for the book of Psalms. So, brothers, for your Psalm passage, you don't have to do the background context for the whole book of Psalms. Can I see an amen? Can I hear a hallelujah there? Praise God, right? Hallelujah. We can skip to step 4. All right. And that's because, again, the book of Psalms is really not a book in the same sense that every other book of the Bible is, because it is a collection of independent poems. That's how you can think of the Psalms. All right. Later this morning, we're going to go into the Psalms. I'm going to do a full introduction and talk about the Psalms and some details there, because it is a unique book of the Bible, but we don't think of it in the same way we would think of other books. Now, Proverbs is an interesting book because it also is a collection of wisdom sayings, but notice at the beginning of the book, Solomon, who's the primary author of the book, he gives a purpose for the book of Proverbs. He gives an overall occasion for the book. And so we understand Proverbs, really, we should read it with an understanding that it is structured like a book. Again, we'll cover this in more detail later in this module. But Psalms is unique in this regard. So for the Psalms, we will look at background context, but just of the Psalm itself, not of the whole book of Psalms. Okay? Each Psalm has its own background context. That's part of the setting of the poem. And so we will study it for the poetic, the passage analysis. Okay? So here's really a summary, the steps to study and preach. I should say each biblical genre, because notice in the 4th step is where we do a unique analysis of a particular book based upon, or passage based upon its genre. Okay, so that yellow highlighted step is the only one that's different. All the others are the same for any book of the Bible except Psalms. Psalms, you skip the first 3 steps, but every other book of the Bible, you do the first 3 steps. Then when you get to the 4th step, for epistles, we don't do the 4th step. The epistles, we jump right to the block diagram. But for narrative or poetry or prophecy, we do a step specific to that type of biblical genre. Okay? So hopefully this shows you just how, the exegetical process is essentially the same for every book of the Bible, with only the difference here in the 4th step depending on the type of genre of the book. All right. The preaching of the putting together the sermon, it's going to be the same for every book. Identify the timeless truths, the reflection, the sermon main point, outline, all of those will be the same, except how you preach that message will vary a little bit. It will be a little bit different depending on whether it's a narrative or a poem or an epistle. Okay. We'll cover that later. I'm just giving you sort of this is the big picture of the whole process here. All right. And I just want you to know that it's very, very similar in most every step that from what we have looked at before, except there'll be a few differences along the way. Okay. All right. Any questions, comments so far? This is the big picture. Okay. Well, what I'd like to do is, and here I just is to talk about now. Whoops. I'd like to sort of move to the first type of first passage you're going to study is from the book of Psalms. You're each assigned a psalm. And by the way, if you want to know how to find that, I think I showed this to you before, but I'll go ahead and do it right now since we're talking about it, is to, let me open up the Canvas for you. On Canvas, I have put a overall schedule for the class, as well as a your passage assignments for this module. All right, so I'm logging into Canvas right now, so let me show you that. All right, so here I'm just logging in. And on Canvas here, we'll go to Preaching Narrative and Poetry and Wisdom. And now, if we go to, remember that key page that I tell you about is here on this link to download all course files. This is a very important link. I probably should make it bigger, highlight it, because this is where you can find all of the, in fact, I'm going to do that right now before we go any further. So just give me a minute. I'm going to highlight this link. Here, in fact, I'm going to do this. Oops. I'll put it here. I'm going to make it bigger. Let's see, bold, and where's the font? There we are, size. Let me do this. Okay. There we go. I made it much bigger. Okay, so if you go to here, this link, okay, it's on the main page. So right when you log in, this is the main page. Go to this link, and from that, you'll see all the key information and documents for this class. All right. For each session, I put the class notes here so you can download them. I put the assignment if there is one for that week. And then I put the link to the videos. Okay. So for session 1, there's the class notes. Then there was a reading assignment. And then here I had 2 parts of the video because I had a problem with the recording. All right. So if you look at this for every session, all right, I have the same. I have the handout here. I have the assignment and then the video. Now look at the top. Oh, I didn't put it here yet. Okay. That's why it's not at the top of this page. I'm going to put in here, I'm going to put in the class schedule and assigned passages. I'll do that later this week, okay? And I'll have a link here where you can, again, I'll make it large and all right, let me see if I can center it as well here. Okay, so right now I don't have it up yet, but I will put it in here for you and it'll have that information. Okay, so it'll be right here. I'll put a link here and you can download that. It'll have the schedule, like each week, the plan, and then your assigned passages. And each of you, I'm going to assign a passage, one psalm, a short psalm, except for, I think, Pastor Noor, I'm going to assign him Psalm 119. All right, we'll just have him preach the whole psalm in 30 minutes. Because your sermons are so short. So you can do a Psalm 119 in 30 minutes. But no, I'll give each of you, most of the Psalms that I'll give you, like 5 or 6 verses. All right. So you'll each be assigned one Psalm. And then I'll also assign you a passage from Proverbs, from one of the first 9 chapters in Proverbs. Okay, because those first 9 chapters are extended poems in Proverbs. Proverbs 10 and on are the short verses, but Proverbs 1 to 9 are actually extended psalms or poems. Sorry. So each of you will have one psalm and then also one passage from Proverbs. And so beginning in another week or so, you'll be seeing the written assignments, which will be covering the steps for studying your psalm. Okay, so there'll be written assignments for your psalm passage and written assignments for your Proverbs passage, just like we did for the narrative, right? You had a Jonah you had Jonah or Ruth as one passage, so you had all the written assignments for that one. And then you had the John passage. You had all the written assignments for that one. It'll be the same here for this, okay? So because your first passage will be from the Psalms, what I'd like to do is we're going to spend the rest of today and some time next week on, where is it? On understanding the Psalms. So I want to give you an introduction to the Psalms because there's some things about the Psalms that you need to understand if you're going to preach from the Psalms. Okay? And so what I want to do is just give you that some of those details. All right? So before looking at the 4th step, which is the poetic analysis, we need to have an understanding of the book of Psalms itself, all right, and how it's structured. Why is this? Because, one, the book of Psalms is the most prominent book of Hebrew poetry in the Bible. It is the book you think about or consider when you talk about poetry in the Bible. You think of the Psalms primarily. So, and it is unique among all the books of the Bible, and that it's an anthology. Again, it's a collection of independent poems. Okay, and also too, we need to understand how the Psalms function. How do they work? There are some unique features to the Psalms that we should be aware of, and also too, some Psalms are found in other books. We could add to this even Luke 1, 46. And following, Mary's Magnificat. There are psalms that are contained in other books of the Bible, so it's helpful. A psalm is a unique type of poem. Okay, I guess I should say that. A psalm is a particular or unique type of poem. Okay, so it has features, certain features that you want to be aware of as we look at it. Okay, so that's why I want to do a special focus right now, an introduction to the Psalms. All right, so I'm going to give you a overview, and then I'm going to give you like a little kind of like a little quiz, all right, just to see how well you know the book of Psalms. Okay, so be ready. All right, but first let me just give you a basic overview. I think a lot of these details you already know, but just want to clarify them or identify them. The Psalms are, again, a collection of 150 individual poems, independent poems, which make up the largest book in the Bible, right? In terms of number of words, the Psalms is the largest book, but again, it's not like any other book in the Bible because it's a collection of independent poems. The word psalm actually is a Greek word, psalmos, which means basically a song of praise, a song from a stringed instrument, or it could mean the plucking of strings, making music on a stringed instrument. The Hebrew word for psalms is a mitzmor. It's a song with instruments. All right, so that's just a simple understanding of the word psalms. Now, it's interesting, the book of Psalms, there's a title for it in Hebrew. It's called the Tehelem, which means praises, which is interesting because praise is indeed a focus of many psalms, but there's lots of psalms that are not songs of praise. They're laments, or they're instructional psalms of wisdom, or they're psalms that speak of Zion. There are many psalms that are not praise psalms, but it's interesting how the book was titled as a Tehelem, or a book or praises, songs of praise. But again, as we will learn, and as you know, not all psalms are psalms of praise. There are other types of psalms as well. Okay, now what I want to do here, I'm going to put all these questions together here. What I'd like you to do, this is like a short little, hopefully fun quiz. You're not going to be graded on this, but I'm going to give you a few minutes, and I want to see if you can answer each of these questions. All right, let me set this up, and then I'll put it back on the screen here for you. All right, give me a second to do this. All right, so get ready. All right, start your time of deep prayer and meditation. Ask the Lord for wisdom and understanding. Okay, as we do this little quiz here together. All right, give me 1 second. I'm putting all the questions right next to each other so you can see them. Okay. All right. So I'll give you a couple of minutes. See if you can come up with the answer to these questions. All right. And then what I'm going to do is we'll go through around, and I'll call on one of you guys to see what you came up with for the answer. All right. So I'll give you a minute here to do that. I'm going to
has nothing to do with Psalm 20.
Right. Yeah, when you're looking at particular psalms, there may be similar statements made in two different psalms, but don't assume that they are together or connected. There's only one place where that could be the case, Psalm 42 and Psalm 43. I believe those may have been one psalm that somehow got separated in the process. Those are the only two that I think could be, a case could be made that they are connected. Other than that, I wouldn't say there's an inspired connection between any of the psalms. Certainly somebody may have seen like connections, and so they put certain psalms in a row. Like, for example, most of Asaph's psalms are all together. The connection being the same author. You'll see Psalm 146 to Psalm 50. Those are together, and they all say a similar thing. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord. And Psalms of Ascent, Psalm 122 to 130, was it 4? They're all together because they're a particular purpose, that they all share the same purpose. Psalm 96 through 99, those are all the same kind of psalm, called enthronement psalms. So those were grouped together. But we wouldn't say that to understand Psalm 97, you need to study Psalm 96. Okay, for example. All right, Psalm 97 stands alone. Psalm 96 stands alone. Now, there are doctrinal truths, maybe from other parts of the Bible, that help us understand Psalm 96. But we don't, the background of Psalm 96 isn't found in another Psalm necessarily. Now, I believe those Psalms, Psalm 96 and Psalm 98, were written at the same time because they are strongly connected to Second Chronicles 16, I think. We see a lot of similarities there. So I think the background of those Psalms is at the same time. So I think Psalm 96 and 98 and 99 share a similar background, but they're independent poems. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
That's why, Pastor Tim, we do not use the word chapter in Psalms. So we will not use Psalms chapter 23 because they are independent collection of books.
yeah, that's a good point.
Mm,
So we would call it Psalm 23.
okay.
Yeah. And like I said, Psalm 42, Psalm 43 is the only one that I believe could be shared. Now, some people say that I think it's Psalm 9 and Psalm 10, Psalm 112 and 113. There are some people that say a number of Psalms are actually connected. I don't agree with that, except for, like I said, maybe Psalm 42 and 43. And I think we already talked about that a little bit, didn't we? When we looked at the poetic devices, we talked about refrain, and they share the same refrain. So,
Okay.
Alan, did you have a question earlier? Pastor Alan, did you have a question?
It's just a comment, Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
From our study today, I was thinking that what we've learned challenges us to be more accurate in terms of, kasi timeline is most of the time, the timeline of the Bible most of the time is not brought to the fore in our studies or preachings. But from what I've learned, we have to be more accurate to the timelines because it's very important. Because they bring to us the context. For example, post-exilic Psalms, like that. So it brings us to the time, like the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, those post-exilic Jews, and those exilic Psalms also. It adds to the color of the presentation.
Yes.
It makes it more lively.
Yeah, I get.
Just a comment, Pastor.
No, that's good. Thank you. As we study the background, we will see, like, there are connections with the Psalms to other books of the Bible. We'll find the context and the history for many of them. For example, like the exile, even though we don't know who wrote Psalm 126, we certainly know the historical background to the exile and what happened there. And so that gives us some information of some of the background. And then if we know who the author is, then that gives more details of the background. If we know David wrote it, or Asaph wrote it, or Solomon. So yeah, that enriches our understanding of each of those Psalms. And we'll cover that next time when we talk about the poetry analysis. We want to look at the background and setting of the poem. So, okay, well, let me let you guys go. I know it's lunchtime, and I'll have to record I'll record separately what we covered there that I forgot to record. But thank you guys for your patience and your diligence. If I could get Pastor Noor, could you close us in prayer?
Let us pray, dear God, loving